Chapter 2. Odin, the father of gods and men. Odin, Wotan, or Woden, was the highest and the holiest god of the northern races. He was the all-pervading spirit of the universe, the personification of the air, the god of universal wisdom and victory, and the leader and protector of princes and heroes. As all the gods were supposed to be descended from him, he was surnamed Allfather, and as eldest and chief among them he occupied the highest seat in Asgard. Known by the name of Hlidskjalf, this chair was not only an exalted throne, but also a mighty watchtower, from whence he could overlook the whole world and see at glance all that was happening among gods, giants, elves, dwarves, and men. From the hall of heaven he rode away to Hlidskjalf and sat upon his throne, the mount from whence his eye surveys the world. And far from heaven he turned his shining orbs to look at Midgard and the earth and men. Odin's personal appearance. None but Odin and his wife and Queen Frigga were privileged to use this seat, and when they occupied it, they generally gazed towards the south and west, the goal of all the hopes and excursions of the northern nations. Odin was generally represented as a tall, vigorous man, about 50 years of age, either with dark curling hair or with a long, grey beard and bald head. He was clad in a suit of grey with a blue hood, and his muscular body was enveloped in a wide blue mantle flecked with grey, an emblem of the sky with its fleecy clouds. In his hand, Odin generally carried the infallible spear Gungnir, which was so sacred that an oath sworn upon its point could never be broken, and on his fingers or arm he wore the marvellous ring, Draupnir, the emblem of fruitfulness, precious beyond compare. When seated upon his throne or armed for the fray, to mingle in which he would often descend to earth, Odin wore his eagle helmet, but when he wandered peacefully about the earth in human guise to see what men were doing, he generally donned a broad-brimmed hat, drawn low over his forehead to conceal the fact that he possessed but one eye. Two ravens, Hugin, Thought, and Munin, Memory, perched upon his shoulders as he sat upon his throne, and these he sent out into the wide world every morning, anxiously waiting for their return at nightfall, when they whispered into his ears news of all they had seen and heard. Thus he was kept well informed about everything that was happening on earth. Hugin and Munin fly each day over the spacious earth. I fear for Hugin that he come not back, yet more anxious I am for Munin. At his feet crouched two wolves or hunting hounds, Guerer and Freki, animals which were therefore considered sacred to him, and of good omen if met by the way. Odin always fed these wolves with his own hands from meat set before him. He required no food at all for himself, and seldom tasted anything except the sacred meat. Guerer and Freki, the war-worn saints, the triumphant sire of hosts, but on wine only, the famed in arms, Odin ever lives. When seated in state upon his throne, Odin rested his feet upon a footstool of gold, the work of the gods, all of whose furniture and utensils were fashioned either of that precious metal or of silver. Besides the magnificent home Glatzheim, where stood the 12 seats occupied by the gods when they met in council, and Valeskjalf, where his throne, Hlidskjalf, was placed, Odin had a third palace in Asgard, situated in the midst of the marvellous grove Glaeser, whose shimmering leaves were of red gold. Valhalla. This palace, called Valhalla, the Hall of the Chosen Slain, had 540 doors, wide enough to allow the passage of 800 warriors abreast, and above the principal gate were a boar's head and an eagle, whose piercing glance penetrated to the far corners of the world. The walls of this marvellous building were fashioned of glittering spears, so highly polished that they illuminated the hall. The roof was a golden shield, and the benches were decorated with fine armour, the god's gifts to his guests. Here long tables afforded ample accommodation for the Einherjar, warriors fallen in battle, who were specifically favoured by Odin. Easily to be known is by those who to Odin come, the mansion by its aspect. Its roof with spears is laid, its hall with shields is decked, with corselets are its benches strewed. The ancient northern nations, who deemed warfare the most honourable of occupations and considered courage the greatest virtue, worshipped Odin principally as god of battle and victory. They believed that whenever a fight is impeding, he sent out his special attendants, the shield, battle, or wish maidens, called Valkyrs, choosers of the slain, who selected from the dead warriors one half of their number, whom they bore on their fleet steeds over the quivering rainbow bridge, Bifrost, into Valhalla. Welcomed by Odin's sons, Hermod and Bragi, the heroes were conducted to the foot of Odin's throne, where they received the praise due to their valor. When some special favourite of the gods was thus brought into Asgard, Allfather, father of the slain, as Odin was called when he presided over the warriors, would sometimes rise from his throne and in person bid him welcome at the great entrance gate. The Feast of the Heroes. Besides the glory of such distinction and the enjoyment of Odin's beloved presence day after day, other more material pleasures awaited the warriors in Valhalla. Generous entertainment was provided for them at the long tables where the beautiful white-armed virgins, the Valkyrs, having laid aside their armour and clad themselves in pure white robes, waited upon them with assiduous attention. These maidens, 9 in number according to some authorities, brought the heroes great horns full of delicious meat, and set before them huge portions of boar's flesh, upon which they feasted heartily. The usual northern drink was beer or ale, but our ancestors fancied this beverage too coarse for the heavenly sphere. They therefore imagined that Allfather kept his table liberally supplied with meat, or hydromel, which was daily furnished in great abundance by his she-goat Hedrun, who continually browsed on the tender leaves and twigs on Lerard, Yggdrasil's topmost branch. Rash war and perilous battle their delight, and immature and red with glorious wound, unpeaceful death their choice, deriving thence a right to feast and dray mortal boughs in Odin's hall, whose blazing roof resound the genuine uproar of those shades who fall in desperate fight, or by some brave attempt. The meat upon which the Einherjar feasted was the flesh of the divine boar Sahrimnir, a marvellous beast daily slain by the cook Andhrimnir, and boiled in the great cauldron Eldhrimnir. But although Odin's guests had true northern appetites and gorged themselves to the full, there was always plenty of meat for all. Andhrimnir cooks in Eldhrimnir, Sahrimnir. 'Tis the best of flesh, but few know what the Einherjar eat. Moreover, the supply was exhaustless, for the boar always come to life again before the time of the next meal. This miraculous renewal of supplies in the larder was not the only wonderful occurrence in Valhalla, for it is related that the warriors, after having eaten and drunk to satiety, always called for their weapons, armed themselves, and rode out into the great courtyard, where they fought against one another, repeating the feats of arms for which they were famed on earth, and recklessly dealing terrible wounds, which, however, were miraculously and completely healed as soon as the dinner horn sounded. All the chosen guests of Odin daily plied the trade of war. From the fields of festal fight, swift they ride in gleaming arms, and gaily at the board of gods quaff the cup of sparkling ale, and eat Sahrimni-sported flesh. Whole and happy at the sound of the horn, and bearing one another no grudge for cruel thrusts given and received, the Einherjar would ride gaily back to Valhalla to renew their feasts in Odin's beloved presence, while the white-armed Valkyrs, with flying hair, glided gracefully about, constantly filling their horns or their favourite drinking vessels, the skulls of their enemies, while the scouts sang of war and of stirring Viking forays. And all day long they there are hacked and hewn, mid dust and groans and limbs lopped off and blood, but all at night return to Odin's hall, woundless and fresh. Such lot is theirs in heaven. Fighting and feasting thus, the heroes were said to spend their days in perfect bliss, while Odin delighted in their strength and number, which, however, he foresaw would not avail to prevent his downfall when the day of the last battle should dawn. As such pleasures were the highest a northern warrior's fancy could paint, it was very natural that all fighting men should love Odin, and early in life should dedicate themselves to his service. They vowed to die arms in hand if possible, and even wounded themselves with their own spears when death drew near, if they had been unfortunate enough to escape death on the battlefield and were threatened with straw death, as they called disease from old age or sickness. To Odin then true fast calves he fair runics, death runes cut deep on his arm and his breast. In reward for this devotion, Odin watched with special care over his favorites, giving them gifts, a magic sword, a spear, or a horse, and making them invincible until their last hour had come, when he himself appeared to claim or destroy the gift he had bestowed, and the Valkyrs bore the heroes to Valhalla. He gave to Hermod a helm and corselet, and for him Sigmund a sword received. Sleipnir. When Odin took an active part in war, he generally rode his 8-footed grey steed Sleipnir and bore a wide shield. His glittering spear flung over the heads of the combatants was the signal for the fray to commence, and he would dash into the midst of the ranks shouting his war cry, "Odin has you all." And Odin donned his dazzling corset and his helm of gold, and led the way on Sleipnir. At times he used his magic bow, from which he would shoot 10 arrows at once, every one invariably bringing down a foe. Odin was also supposed to inspire his favorite warriors with the renowned berserker rage, bersark or shirt, which enabled them, although naked, weaponless, and sore beset, to perform unheard-of feats of valor and strength, and move about as with charmed lives. As Odin's characteristics, like the all-pervading elements, were multitudinous, so also were his names, of which he had no less than 200, almost all descriptive of some phase of his activities. He was considered the ancient god of seamen and of the wind. Mighty Odin, Norsemen hearts, we bend to thee. Steer our barks, O potent Woden, o'er this surging Baltic Sea. The Wild Hunt. Odin, as wind god, was pictured as rushing through mid-air on his 8-footed steed, from which originated the oldest northern riddle, which runs as follows. Who are the two who ride to the thing? 3 eyes have they together, 10 feet, and 1 tail, and thus they travel through the lands. And as the souls of the dead were supposed to be wafted away on the wings of the storm, Odin was worshipped as the leader of all disembodied spirits. In this character he was most generally known as the Wild Huntsman, and when people heard the rush and roar of the wind, they cried aloud in superstitious fear, fancying they heard and saw him ride past with his train, all mounted on snorting steeds and accompanied by baying hounds. And the passing of the Wild Hunt, known as Woden's Hunt, the raging host, Gabriel's hounds, or Asgardria, was also considered a presage of such misfortune as pestilence or war. The Rhine flows bright, and its waves ere long must hear a voice of war, and a clash of spears are hears among, and a trumpet from afar, and the brave on a bloody turf must lie, for the huntsman hath gone by. It was further thought that if any were so sacrilegious as to join in the wild halloo in mockery, they would be immediately snatched up and whirled away with the vanishing host, while those who joined in the halloo with implicit good faith would be rewarded by the sudden gift of a horse's leg, hurled at them from above, which, if carefully kept until the morrow, would be changed into a lump of gold. Even after the introduction of Christianity, the ignorant northern folk still dreaded the oncoming storm, declaring that it was the wild hunt sweeping across the sky. And oft times will start, for overhead are sweeping Gabriel's hounds, doomed with their impious lure to the flying heart, to chase forever on aerial grounds. Sometimes it left behind a small black dog, which, cowering and whining upon a neighbouring hearth, had to be kept for a whole year and carefully tended, unless it could be exercised or frightened away. The usual recipe, the same as for the riddance of challengings, was to brew beer and eggshells, and this performance was supposed so to startle the spectral dog that he would fly with his tail between his legs, exclaiming that, although as old as the Behemoth or Bohemian forest, he had never before beheld such an uncanny sight. I am as old as the Behemoth wold, and have in my life such a brewing not seen. The object of this phantom hunt varied greatly, and was either a visionary boar or wild horse, wide-breasted maidens who were caught and borne away bound only once in 7 years, or the wood nymphs, called moss maidens, who were thought to represent the autumn leaves torn from the trees and whirled away by the wintry gale. In the Middle Ages, when the belief in the old heathen deities were partially forgotten, the leader of the wild hunt was no longer Odin, but Charlemagne, Frederick Barbarossa, King Arthur, or some Sabbath breaker, like the Squire of Rodenstein or Hans von Hackelberg, who, in punishment for his sins, was condemned to hunt forever through the realms of air. As the winds blew fiercest in autumn and winter, Odin was supposed to prefer hunting during this season, especially during the time between Christmas and Twelfth Night, and the peasants were always careful to leave the last sheaf or measure of grain out in the fields to serve as food for his horse. This hunt was of course known by various names in the different countries of northern Europe, but as the tales told about it are all alike, they evidently originated in the same old heathen belief, and to this day ignorant people of the north fancy that the baying of a hound on a stormy night is an infallible presage of death. Still shall last the dreadful chase, till time itself shall have an end. By day they scour earth's cavern space, at midnight's witching hour ascend. This is the horn and hound and horse that oft the lated peasant hears. Appalled, his signs they frequent cross, when the wild din invades his ears. The wakeful priest oft drops a tear for human pride, for human woe, when at his midnight mass he hears the infernal cry of Holy Ho. The wild hunt, or raging host of Germany, was called Herlething in England, for the mythical King Herle, its supposed leader. In northern France it bore the name of Mesne de Heliquin, from Hel, goddess of death, and in the Middle Ages it was known as Cain's Hunt or Herod's Hunt, these latter names being given because the leaders were supposed to be unable to find rest on account of the iniquitous murders of Abel, of John the Baptist, and of the Holy Innocents. In central France, the wild huntsmen, whom we have already seen in other countries as Odin, Charlemagne, Barbarossa, Rodenstein, von Hackelberg, King Arthur, Hel, one of the Swedish kings, Gabriel, Cain, or Herod, is also called the Great Huntsman of Fontainebleau, and people declare that on the eve of Henry IV's murder, and also just before the outbreak of the Great French Revolution, his shouts were distinctly heard as he swept across the sky. It was generally believed among the northern nations that the soul escaped from the body in the shape of a mouse, which crept out of a corpse's mouth and ran away, and was also said to creep in and out of the mouths of people in a trance. While the soul was absent, no effort or remedy could recall the patient to life, but as soon as it had come back, animation returned. The Pied Piper. As Odin was the leader of all disembodied spirits, he was identified in the Middle Ages as the Pied Piper of Hamelin. According to medieval legends, Hamelin was so infested by rats that life became unbearable, and a large reward was offered to any who would rid the town of these rodents. A piper, in parti-coloured garments, offered to undertake the commission, and the terms being accepted, he commenced to play through the street in such wise that one and all the rats were beguiled out of their holes until they formed a vast procession. There was that in the strains which compelled them to follow, until at last the river Weser was reached, and all were drowned in its tide. And ere 3 shrill notes the pipe uttered, you heard as if an army muttered. And the muttering grew to a grumbling, and the grumbling grew to a mighty rumbling, and out of the houses the rats came tumbling. Great rats, small rats, lean rats, brawny rats, brown rats, black rats, grey rats, tawny rats, grave old plodders, gay young friskers, fathers, mothers, uncle, cousins, cockling tails and prickling whiskers, families by tens and dozens. Brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, followed the piper for their lives. From street to street he piped advancing, and step for step they followed dancing, until they came to the river Weser, wherein all plunged and perished. As the rats were all dead, and there was no chance of their returning to plague them, the people of Hamelin refused to pay the reward, and they bade the piper do his worst. He took them at their word, and a few moments later the weird strains of magic flute again rose, and this time it was the children who swarmed out of the houses and merrily followed the piper. There was a rustling that seemed like a bustling of merry crowds jostling at pitching and hustling. Small feet were pattering, wooden shoes clattering, little hands clapping and little tongues chattering, and like fowls in a farmyard when barley is scattering, out came all the children running. All the little boys and girls with rosy cheeks and flaxen curls and sparkling eyes and teeth like pearls, tripping and skipping, ran merrily after the wonderful music, with shouting and laughter. The burghers were powerless to prevent this tragedy, and as they stood spellbound, the piper led the children out of the town to the Koppelberg, a hill at the confines of the town which miraculously opened to receive the procession, and only closed again when the last child had passed out of sight. This legend probably originated the adage to pay the piper. The children were never seen in Emlyn again, and in commemoration of this public calamity, all official decrees have since been dated so many years after the Pied Piper's visit. They made a decree that lawyers never should think their records dated duly, if after the day of the month and year these words did not as well appear, and so long after what happened here, on the 22nd of July, 1376, and the better in memory to fix the place of the children's last retreat, they called it the Pied Piper Street, where anyone playing on piper tabor was sure for the future to lose his labour. In this myth, Odin is the piper. The shrill tones of the flute are emblematic of the whistling wind. The rats represent the souls of the dead, which cheerfully follow him, and the hollow mountain into which he leads the children is typical of the grave. Bishop Hatto. Another German legend which owes its existence to this belief is the story of Bishop Hatto, the miserly prelate who, annoyed by the clamours of the poor during a time of famine, had them burned alive in a deserted barn, like the rats whom he declared they resembled, rather than give them some of the precious grain which he had laid up for himself. "I faith 'tis an excellent bonfire," quoth he, "and the country is greatly obliged to me for riding it in these times forlorn of rats that only consume the corn." Soon after this terrible crime had been accomplished, the bishop's retainers reported the approach of a vast swarm of rats. These, it appears, were the souls of the murdered peasants, which had assumed the forms of the rats to which the bishop had likened them. His efforts to escape were vain, and the rats pursued him even into the middle of the Rhine, to a stone tower in which he took refuge from their fangs. They swam to the tower, gnawed their way through the stone walls, and pouring in on all sides at once, they found the bishop and devoured him alive. And in at the windows, and in at the door, and through the walls, helter-skelter they pour, and down from the ceiling, and up from the floor, from the right and the left, from behind and before, from within and without, from above and below, and all at once to the bishop they go. They have whetted their teeth against the stones, and now they pick the bishop's bones. They gnawed the flesh from every limb, for they were sent to do judgment on him. The red glow of the sunset above the rat tower near Bingen on the Rhine is supposed to be the reflection of the hellfire in which the wicked bishop is slowly roasting in punishment for his heinous crime. Ermin. In some parts of Germany, Odin is considered to be identical with the Saxon god Ermin, whose statue, the Erminsul, near Paderborn, was destroyed by Charlemagne in 772. Ermin was said to possess a ponderous brazen chariot in which he rode across the sky along the path which we know as the Milky Way, but which the ancient Germans designated as Ermin's Way. This chariot, whose rumbling sound occasionally became perceptible to mortal ears as thunder, never left the sky, where it can still be seen in the constellation of the Great Bear, which is also known in the north as Odin's or Charles' Wain. The Wain who heels on high his circling course and on Orion waits, sole star that never bathes in the ocean wave. Mimir's Well. To obtain the great wisdom for which he is so famous, Odin in the morn of time visited Mimir's memory spring, the fountain of all wit and wisdom, in whose liquid depths even the future was clearly mirrored, and besought the old man who guarded it to let him have a draught. But Mimir, who well knew the value of such favour, for his spring was considered the source of headwater of memory, refused the boon unless Odin would consent to give one of his eyes in exchange. The god did not hesitate, so highly did he prize the draught. but immediately plucked out one of his eyes, which Mimir kept in pledge, sinking it deep down into his fountain, where it shone with mild lustre, leaving Odin with but one eye, which is considered emblematic of the sun. Through our whole lives we strive towards the sun. That burning forehead is the eye of Odin. His second eye, the moon, shines not so bright. It has he placed in pledge in Mimir's fountain, that he may fetch the healing waters thence each morning for the strengthening of this eye. Drinking deeply of Mimir's fount, Odin gained the knowledge he coveted, and he never regretted the sacrifice he had made. But as further memorial of that day broke off a branch of the sacred tree Yggdrasil, which overshadowed the spring, and fashioned from it his beloved spear Gungnir. A dauntless god drew for drink to its gleam, where he left in endless payment the light of an eye. From the world Asher wrote and went, he broke a bow. For a spear the staff he split with strength from the stem. But although Odin was now all-wise, he was sad and oppressed, for he had gained an insight into futurity, and had become aware of the transitory nature of all things, and even of the fate of the gods, who were doomed to pass away. This knowledge so affected his spirits that he ever after wore a melancholy and contemplative expression. To test the value of the wisdom he had thus obtained, Odin went to visit the most learned of all the giants, Vafthrudnir, and entered with him into a contest of wit, in which the stake was nothing less than the loser's head. Odin rose with speed and went to contend in runic law with the wise and crafty youth. To Vafthrudnir's royal hall came the mighty king of spells. Odin and Vafthrudnir. On this occasion, Odin had disguised himself as a wanderer by Frigga's advice, and when asked his name, declared it was Gangrad. The contest of wit immediately began, Vafthrudnir questioning his guest concerning the horses which carried day and night across the sky, the river Ithing separating Jotunheim from Asgard, and also Vigrid, the field where the last battle was to be fought. All these questions were minutely answered by Odin, who, when Vafthrudnir had ended, began the interrogatory in his turn, and received equally explicit answers about the origin of heaven and earth, the creation of the gods, their quarrel with the Vanas, the occupations of the heroes in Valhalla, the offices of the Norns, and the rulers who were to replace the Aesir, when they had all perished with the world they had created. But when, in conclusion, Odin bent near the giant and softly inquired what words Allfather whispered to his dead son Balder as he lay upon his funeral pyre, Vafthrudnir suddenly recognized his divine visitor. Starting back in dismay, he declared that no one but Odin himself could answer that question, and that it was now quite plain to him that he had madly striven in a contest of wisdom and wit with the king of the gods, and fully deserved the penalty of failure, the loss of his head. Not the man of mortal race knows the words which thou hast spoken to thy son in days of yore. I hear the coming tread of death. He soon shall raise the runic law and knowledge of the rise of gods. From his ill-fated soul who strove with Odin's self the strife of wit, wisest of the wise that breathe. Our stake was life, and thou hast won. And is the case with so many of the northern myths, which are often fragmentary and obscure. This one ends here, and none of the scouts informs us whether Odin really slew his rival, nor what was the answer to his last question. But mythologists have hazarded the suggestion that the word by Odin in Balder's ear to console him for his untimely death must have been resurrection. Invention of runes. Besides being god of wisdom, Odin was god and inventor of runes, the earliest alphabet used by northern nations, which characters signifying mystery were at first used for divination, although in later times they served for inscriptions and records. Just as wisdom could only be obtained at the cost of sacrifice, Odin himself relates that he hung 9 days and nights from the sacred tree Yggdrasil, gazing down into the immeasurable depths of Niflheim, plunged in deep thought, and self-wounded with his spear, ere he won the knowledge he sought. I know that I hung on a wing-rocked tree 9 whole nights, with a spear wounded, and to Odin offered myself to myself, on that tree of which no one knows from what root it springs. When he had fully mastered this knowledge, Odin cut magic runes upon his spear Gungnir, upon the teeth of his horse Sleipnir, upon the claws of the bear, and upon countless other animate and inanimate things. And because he had thus hung over the abyss for such a long space of time, he was ever after considered the patron divinity of all who were condemned to be hanged, or who perished by the noose. After obtaining the gift of wisdom and runes, which gave him power over all things, Odin also coveted the gift of eloquence and poetry, which he acquired in a manner which we shall relate in a subsequent chapter. Geirrod and Agnar. Odin, as has already been stated, took great interest in the affairs of mortals, and, we are told, was specifically fond of watching King Hrauding's handsome little sons, Geirrod and Agnar, when they were about 8 and 10 years of age respectively. One day these little lads went fishing, and a storm suddenly arose which blew their boat far out to sea, where it finally stranded upon an island, upon which dwelt a seeming old couple, who in reality were Odin and Frigga in disguise. They had assumed these forms in order to indulge a sudden passion for the close society of their protégés. The lads were warmly welcomed and kindly treated, Odin choosing Geirrod as his favourite and teaching him the use of arms, while Frigga petted and made much of little Agnar. The boys tarried on the island with their kind protectors during the long, cold winter season, but when spring came and the skies were blue and the sea calm, they embarked in a boat which Odin provided, and set out for their native shore. Favoured by gentle breezes, they were soon wafted thither. But as the boat neared the strand, Geirrod quickly sprang out and pushed it far back into the water, bidding its brother sail away into the evil spirit's power. At that self-same moment the wind veered, and Agnar was indeed carried away, while his brother hastened to his father's palace with a lying tale as to what had happened to his brother. He was joyfully received as one from the dead, and in due time he succeeded his father upon the throne. Years passed by, during which the attention of Odin had been claimed by other high considerations, when one day, while the divine couple was seated on the throne Hlidskjalf, Odin suddenly remembered the winter sojourn on the desert island, and he bade his wife notice how powerful his pupil had become, and taunted her because her favourite Agnar had married a giantess and had remained poor and of no consequence. Frigga quietly replied that it was better to be poor than hard-hearted, and accused Geirrod of lack of hospitality, one of the most heinous crimes in the eyes of the Northmen. She even went so far as to declare that in spite of all his wealth, he often ill-treated his guests. When Odin heard this accusation, he declared that he would prove the falsity of the charge by assuming the guise of a wanderer and testing Geirrod's generosity. Wrapped in his cloud-hued raiment, with slouch hat and pilgrim's staff, "Wanderer calls me the world, far have I carried my feet. On the back of the earth I have bondlessly been." Odin immediately set out by a roundabout way, while Frigga, to outwit him, immediately dispatched a swift messenger to warn Geirrod to beware of a man in white mantle and broad-brimmed hat, as he was a wicked enchanter who would work him ill. When, therefore, Odin presented himself before the king's palace, he was dragged into Geirrod's presence and questioned roughly. He gave his name as Grimnir, but refused to tell whence he came or what he wanted, as this reticence confirmed the suspicion suggested to the mind of Geirrod. He allowed his love of cruelty full play, and commanded that the stranger should be bound between two fires, in such wise that the flames played around him without quite touching him, and he remained thus 8 days and nights in obstinate silence, without food. Now Agnar had returned secretly to his brother's palace, where he occupied a menial position, and one night, when all was still, in pity for the suffering of the unfortunate captive, he conveyed to his lips a horn of ale. But for this, Odin would have had nothing to drink, the most serious of all trials to the god. At the end of the 8th day, while Geirrod, seated upon his throne, was gloating over his prisoner's suffering, Odin began to sing, softly at first, and louder, until the hall re-echoed with his triumphant notes, a prophecy that the king, who had so long enjoyed the god's favour, would soon perish by his own sword. Fallen by the sword, he shall now have. Thy life is now run out. Wroth with thee are the Disir. Odin thou now shalt see. Draw near to me, if thou canst. As the last notes died away, the chains dropped from his hands, the flames flickered and went out, and Odin stood in the midst of the hall, no longer in human form, but in all the power and beauty of a god. On hearing the ominous prophecy, Guerer hastily drew his sword, intending to slay the insolent singer. But when he beheld the sudden transformation, he started in dismay, tripped, fell upon the sharp blade, and perished, as Odin had foretold. Turning to Agnar, who, according to some accounts, was the king's son, not his brother, for these old stories are often strangely confused, Odin bade him ascend the throne in reward for his humanity, and, further to repay him for the timely draught of ale, he promised to bless him with all manner of prosperity. On another occasion, Odin wandered to earth and was absent so long that the gods began to think that they would not see him in Asgard again. This encouraged his brothers, Vili and Ve, who by some mythologists are considered as other personifications of himself, to usurp his power and his throne, and even, we are told, to espouse his wife, Frigga. Be thou silent, Frigg, thou art Fjugvin's daughter, and never hast been fond of men since Ve and Vili, it is said, thou Vidre's wife didst both to thy bosom take. May Day Festivals. But upon Odin's return, the usurpers vanished forever, and in commemoration of the disappearance of the false Odin, who had ruled 7 months and had brought nothing but unhappiness to the world, and of the return of the benevolent deity, the heathen Northmen celebrated yearly festivals, which were long continued as May Day rejoicings. Until very lately, there was always on that day a grand procession in Sweden, known as the May Ride, in which a flower-decked May King, Odin, pelted with blossoms the fur-enveloped winter, his supplanter, until he put him to ignominious flight. In England, also the 1st of May was celebrated as a festive occasion, in which Maypole dancers, May Queens, Maid Marian, and Jack in the Green played prominent parts. As personification of heaven, Odin, of course, was the lover and spouse of the earth, and as to them the earth bore the threefold aspect, the Northmen depicted him as a polygamist, and allotted to him several wives. The first among these were Jord, Erda, the primitive earth, daughter of Night, or of the giantess Fjorgen. She bore him his famous son Thor, the god of thunder. The second and principal wife was Frigga, personification of the civilized world. She gave him Balder, a gentle god of spring, Hermod, and, according to some authorities, Tyr. The third wife was Rinda, a personification of the hard and frozen earth, who reluctantly yields to his warm embrace, but finally gives birth to Vali, the emblem of vegetation. Odin is also said to have married Saga or Laga, the goddess of history, hence our verb to say, and to have daily visited her in the crystal hall of Sokvabek, beneath a cool, ever-flowing river, to drink its waters and listen to her songs about olden times and vanished races. Sokvabek hiked the 4th dwelling. Over it flow the cool billows, glad drink their Odin saga, every day from golden cups. His other wives were Grid, the mother of Vidar, Gunlod, the mother of Bragi, Skadi, and the 9 giantesses, who simultaneously bore Heimdall, all of whom play more or less important parts in the various myths of the North. The historical Odin. Besides this ancient Odin, there was a more modern, semi-historical personage of the same name, to whom all the virtues, powers, and adventures of his predecessor have been attributed. He was the chief of the Aesir, inhabitants of Asia Minor, who, sore pressed by the Romans and threatened with destruction or slavery, left their native land about 70 BC and migrated into Europe. This Odin is said to have conquered Russia, Germany, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, leaving a son on the throne of each conquered country. He also built the town of Odense. He was welcomed in Sweden by Gifli, the king, who gave him a share of the realm and allowed him to found the city of Sigtuna, where he built a temple and introduced a new system of worship. Tradition further relates that as his end drew near, this mythical Odin assembled his followers, publicly cut himself 9 times in the breast with his spear, a ceremony called carving Guerer odds, and told them he was about to return to his native land, Asgard, his old home, where he would await their coming, to share with him a life of feasting, drinking, and fighting. According to another account, Gylfi, having heard of the power of the Aesir, the inhabitants of Asgard, and wishing to ascertain whether these reports were true, journeyed to the south. In due time he came to Odin's palace, where he was expected, and where he was deluded by the vision of Har, Ifnhar, and Thridi, 3 divinities, enthroned one above the other. The gatekeeper, Gangler, answered all his questions and gave him a long explanation of Northern mythology, which is recorded in the Younger Edda, and then, having finished his instructions, suddenly vanished with the palace amid a deafening noise. According to other very ancient poems, Odin's sons, Veldeg, Beldeg, Sigi, Skjold, Siming, and Yngvi, became kings of East Saxony, West Saxony, Franconia, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and from them are descended the Saxons, Hengist, and Horsa, and the royal families of the northern islands. Still another version relates that Odin and Frigga had 7 sons, who founded the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. In the course of time, this mysterious king was co-founded with the Odin whose worship he introduced, and of all his deeds were attributed to the god. Odin was worshipped in numerous temples, but especially in the great fane at Uppsala, where the most solemn festivals were held, and where sacrifices were offered. The victim was generally a horse, but in times of pressing need human offerings were made, even the king being once offered up to avert a famine. Uppsala's temple, where the north saw Valhall's halls fair imaged here on earth. The first toast at every festival here was drunk in his honor, and besides the 1st of May, one day in every week was held sacred to him, and from his Saxon name Woden was called Wednesday, whence the English word Wednesday has been derived. It was customary for the people to assemble at his shrine on festive occasions to hear the songs of the scouts, who were rewarded for their ministry by the gift of golden bracelets or armlets, which curled up at the ends and were called Odin's serpents. There are but a few remains of ancient northern art now extant, and although rude statues of Odin were once quite common, they have all disappeared, as they were made of wood, a perishable substance which in the hands of the missionaries, and especially of Olaf the Saint, the northern iconoclast, was soon reduced to ashes. There in the temple carved in wood, the image of great Odin stood. Odin himself is supposed to have given his people a code of laws whereby to govern their conduct in a poem called Havamal, or the High Song, which forms part of the Edda. In this lay he taught the fallibility of man, the necessity for courage, temperance, independence, and truthfulness, respect for old age, hospitality, charity, and contentment, and gave instructions for the burial of the dead. At home let a man be cheerful, and toward a guest liberal. Of wise conduct he should be, of good memory and ready speech. If much knowledge he desires, he must often talk on what is good.